Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Seven Steps. As always, I am Seven, your guide to the weirder side of the internet. Tonight, we delve into the gray area between fact and possibility, taking a look at some often seen but rarely substantiated creatures of lore, the cryptids. Our first story takes place in New Mexico and involves skinwalkers, cryptids out of Native American folklore. I went camping a few months back in New Mexico with a friend of mine, David, who has family there. If you like rustic desert scenery, there are few places in this country more beautiful than the Sandia Mountains northeast of Albuquerque. We spent a good part of our first day just hoofing it through the Cibola National Forest as we made our way towards the mountain range. We had plenty more ground to cover before we got to the foot of the mountains, and not much daylight left, so we bivouacked down for the night when we found a place suitably less rocky than the majority of the trail had been. In the interest of traveling light, and for the simple fact that we'd be in a pretty dry climate, we didn't bring a tent with us, so our tiny camp was essentially 2 sleeping bags next to a fire pit, where we cooked our dinner. Not long after sundown, we decided to call it a night so we could wake before dawn and get on the move before the day got too hot. A couple of hours or so after I had managed to drift off to sleep, I woke to the sound of my friend David's voice calling out to me. "Hey, over here, come take a look at this." I heard his voice trail off into the woods near the edge of the clearing. I looked around the camp to make sure I wasn't imagining things and saw David's sleeping bag was open and empty. I called back to him sleepily, asking what he'd found, but he just repeated himself. "Over here. Come take a look at this." In my bleary state, I didn't notice how strange the voice sounded at the time. Maybe I was still just half asleep, but looking back, it was pretty out of the ordinary. Almost as if there were 2 voices layered on top of each other. One was clearly the voice of my friend, but the other was lower and significantly distorted. Groggily, I made my way out of the sleeping bag and slipped on my boots before walking into the darkness. I was nearly to the tree line when the voice called out again. "Over here. Come take a look at this." It was almost mechanical in its repetition. No shifting in tone or urgency, just that same flat bleat. As I started to shout back to him that I was coming, something grabbed my wrist from behind. Then a second hand clasped over my mouth, stifling a short yelp of surprise. The grip on my wrist loosened as I spun to find David staring back at me, his eyes the size of dinner plates. He held one finger up to his lips and shook his head as he motioned with his free hand for me to follow him. I was confused, to say the least, but the look on his face told me that whatever was happening, it wasn't good, so I followed him back towards our little campsite. Once we arrived, he pointed at my pack and sleeping bag before quietly beginning to roll his own sleeping bag into a tight bundle. "What the fuck is going on, man?" I asked him stupidly as I stood in the middle of the clearing. He looked back at me with that same urgent expression and brought his finger back to his lips, and then he pointed at my sleeping bag again and made a rolling gesture. I'm pretty thick sometimes, but I understood his body language well enough to know that something had obviously spooked him, enough to make him decide to pull up stakes and find a new spot to sleep in the middle of the night. So I collected my things and followed him into the woods back the way we came earlier that day. David didn't stop until we were clear of the trees and back out in the open almost an hour after we had started walking. He told me that the voice in the woods I heard was probably a skinwalker trying to lure me out into the forest. He explained that Cibola was a sacred place to the Navajo, and the skinwalkers who hunted there did so to defile its purity with death and dark magic. I was not buying it. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but I was pretty sure David was just trying to fuck with me. He always was a bit of a prankster, and I had fallen for a good number of his ruses, thick as I am. I was about to call him on his bullshit when I heard my own voice, clear as day, repeat the question I had asked him just before we left the camp earlier that night. "What the fuck is going on, man?" I spun around to see 2 glowing red eyes peering back at me from the tree line about 20 paces behind us. David let out running, and I followed him. We didn't stop until we were back at the truck in the parking lot near the entrance to the national park. We jumped into the cab, and after the engine puttered to life and turned over, we peeled out of the parking lot to the screeching of rubber on asphalt. We didn't talk as we flew down the highway, but David's eyes kept creeping up to check the rearview mirror. So frequently, in fact, that when an enormous black lumbering figure plodded into the headlights, we had to swerve at last second to avoid it. "Holy shit, was that a fucking bear?" I asked, knowing it was far too big to be a black bear and far too black to be a brown bear. He just shook his head and kept glancing nervously up into the rearview mirror as he redlined the old Ford's throttle. I watched his dark skin go pale as milk as his eyes locked onto something in the rearview. He turned to look through the back window and nearly sent us careening into a ditch, but I grabbed the wheel and straightened her out. "What the fuck, man?" was all I could manage as I white-knuckled the steering wheel. "It's chasing us," he said flatly. "Get your fucking hands on the wheel," I screamed as he returned his full attention to the task of driving again. I didn't want to look back, but I had to see it. Some part of me still didn't believe what was happening. Once I was sure David was focused on the road again, I glanced into the mirror on the passenger side. I saw those same glowing red orbs beaming from the pitch silhouette of the thing that was way too big to be a bear. It was no less than 20 yards behind us. I watched it rise from running on 4 legs to standing position as it threw its head back and let out the most unearthly sound I had ever heard. It was like the drone of a siren mixed with the buzzing and chattering of a forest full of insects. The old Ford radio crackled to life and the speakers in the car coughed out that same noise. The cacophony lasted for 5 ear-splitting seconds, and then it was over, and only the roar of the engine pervaded the silence of the night around us. We drove back to his family's place in Albuquerque and never spoke about what happened that night. Even now, as I write this, it still feels like some kind of a horrible dream. So pervasive are stories of skinwalkers and Native American folklore that it makes you wonder what the origins truly are. Nations of people with no connections, language or otherwise, tell such starkly similar stories that it can't be coincidence. Is there a living creature with so abundant a population that people thousands of miles away tell stories of it? Or are these stories just the embodiment of human fears of the time and a desire to put a face on the unknown? My grandfather told me a story once as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear and each star twinkled in the purple sky with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat ready to tell his story. "Way back when I was a boy about your age," he began, "I lived outside an Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on 100 acres ranch, settled between a brambly mountainside with dirt good for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some abandoned farmsteads." The fire sparked and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. "What next?" I asked. "Settle down, boy, and you'll hear it soon enough." Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember, too, when the engine began to sputter and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "God damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road as it coasted to a halt. "Stay here, son," as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up on carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in the hide to cause it to explode. It stunk so bad and I gagged. My skin started to tingle, the back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing and hung still and heavy with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called. "Pa! Pa!" No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this, not until Vietnam and not until I started seeing men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road, through both dim beams of light, across the partly open, domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off his side and looked pensively into the darkness. I realized then that I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. "Well, what happened? What about your father? What did you see?" He sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand that there were legends, old legends. Older than the rock cairns out in the valley, older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, older than the Native American chiefs and their shamans. The Apache, the Hopi, the Cherokee, and all of them old tribes and First Peoples, they told tales. Old stories about dark Native American magic. A deal made with old spirits, of blood sacrifice to gain power. Old power. Enough to fight each other, and the Spaniards, and later the white men that came for their land, their women, and they called them... He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and bodied forward into his tale. Across the fire and the sky and the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and the old mountains, he bodied forward. They called them skinwalkers, shape changers, old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote. But messed up, boy. Long and malformed snouts, teeth like bowie knives, long arms, and standing 7 foot, even hunched over. They'd gut old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through bullets and sabers, part the Spaniards' armor like it was a potato sack. Wily, too, they could change their voice to match a person you knew or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big and fast, and only for a second it ran across the road. Gray and mottled, muscle flexing under its legs, hooves clomping on the road, stringy, muscled, hunched shoulders. It turned, looked right into the cab, looked right into my eyes, and I swear, boy, I saw it grin at me. I sank into my seat in shock, in fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric, and I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens. Charged and full with power. I yelled for my paw, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking as Grandfather told his story. He was still there, so I know he lived, but the supernatural had always fascinated me, and even now I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin, and that's why the gods took their hide. So they could take others, not for long, as the legends say, but maybe an hour before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going on to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him, and I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man, treated me and my ma right. He fought Nazis and saw the worst man in Poland when he freed all of them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I run or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma." As he pulled the truck into gear and pulled out onto the road, our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy. I knew because out the window, out of the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and that grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us. My pa kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward, and said, 'Son, don't look at it. Don't look at it.' And that's how I knew, boy." Whether or not the skinwalker stories ring true to you, there are certain things that you should still take away from these stories. The first people wish to instill fear of the open woods for a reason. There is always something there that can kill you, and there is always something there that is bigger, stronger, and faster than you are. So you should always move with caution, and you should always remember, at any given point, you are only 7 steps away from being one of my stories.